In 1966, Buick quietly shut down the assembly line for its signature V8. But in salvage yards across America, hot rodders were already hunting for the heavy, strangely shaped iron blocks with the vertical valve covers. For 14 years, Buick had engineered this compact motor to quietly move 2-ton luxury cars. It was never meant to be a racing engine. Yet with massive torque ratings peaking at 445 pound-feet, it possessed a violent, off-the-line pulling power that drag racers desperately wanted. While Detroit corporations chased high RPM horsepower wars, garage mechanics were pulling these blocks from wrecked Electras and Rivieras to power stripped-down rail dragsters and custom swap meet builds. The engine was functionally obsolete to General Motors. The factory had moved on. But the salvage yard demand was just beginning. The real story of the Nailhead is not only the story of an engine line being discontinued, it is the story of how an engineering compromise accidentally created a torque empire, and how American hot rodders remembered a machine longer than the corporation that built it. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Flint, Michigan, in 1953. In the early 1950s, the American highway system was expanding, and the machines traveling on it were undergoing a massive shift. Cars were getting wider, heavier, and infinitely more complex, loaded with power steering, power brakes, and automatic transmissions that drained engine output. In Flint, Michigan, the engineers at Buick faced a brutal mechanical wall. For decades, the division's identity had been tied to the Fireball Straight 8, an 8-cylinder engine arranged in one long line. It was smooth, reliable, and perfectly suited for the long, sweeping hoods of pre-war luxury cars. But by 1952, the Straight 8 had become a severe liability on the American road. It was a massive piece of cast iron that weighed well over 800 pounds. It took up an enormous amount of physical space, pushing the firewall back and ruining weight distribution. More importantly, it had reached the absolute physical limit of its breathing capacity. You could not force more air into the long, restrictive intake manifold. America was entering the overhead valve horsepower race. Cadillac and Oldsmobile, Buick's corporate siblings within General Motors, had already introduced modern, short-stroke V8 engines. Compact power plants with cylinders arranged in 2 banks in a V-shape. Buick needed its own V8 to remain competitive in the premium market. The marketing department demanded it for the brand's upcoming 50th anniversary models. The dealers from New York to California needed it to sell the heavy, luxurious Roadmasters and Supers that defined Buick's catalog. But when the engine designers looked at the existing 1953 Buick chassis on the factory floor, they found a structural trap. The physical frame rails of the cars were exceptionally narrow. The steering linkage and front suspension control arms intruded deeply into the engine bay. A conventional V8, like the wide, sprawling design Cadillac was using, simply would not fit between the rails of a Buick. If they wanted to use a standard V8, the company would have to re-engineer the entire front end of the car, altering assembly plant logistics, changing stamping dies, and taking on an unacceptable manufacturing cost. The engineers were given a strict physical boundary. They could not change the car to fit a new motor. They had to invent a V8 narrow enough to drop into a hole designed for a straight 8. The problem was not just casting a narrow iron block in the foundry. The problem was the cylinder head, the upper part of the engine that helps seal the cylinders and contains the valves. In a typical high-performance V8, the valves are angled outward to allow maximum airflow, which naturally makes the top of the engine wide. To make a V8 narrow enough for the 1953 Buick, the engineers had to push the cylinders close together, a design metric known as narrow bore spacing. And more drastically, they had to completely redesign how the engine breathed. They could not angle the valves outward. There was no physical room under the hood. Instead, they stood the valves straight up, placing them vertically side by side in a unique pent-roof combustion chamber. Because the valves had to fit within this incredibly tight cylinder bore, they had to be small. The intake valves on the first iteration measured just 1.75 inches across, and the exhaust valves were a mere 1.25 inches. When mechanics at dealerships first pulled the distinctive vertical valve covers off to perform maintenance. They looked at the long, thin stems and tiny heads. They joked that the valves looked like masonry nails. The factory officially called it the Buick V8, but across American machine shops, garages, and parts counters, the engine immediately earned a name it would never shake: the Nailhead. When it launched for the 1953 model year, the first generation of this V8 displaced 322 cubic inches. It was a revelation in packaging. It weighed roughly 170 pounds less than the straight 8 it replaced, while being 13.5 inches shorter. It produced 188 horsepower in the top trim Roadmaster, and its compact size allowed the Flint assembly plant to drop it seamlessly onto the existing chassis line. For the engineers, it was a massive success. They had solved the packaging problem, avoided a catastrophic chassis redesign, and delivered an engine that could comfortably propel a 4,300-pound luxury car out of a dealership lot. By 1954, Buick expanded the engine family, introducing a smaller 264 cubic inch version for their entry-level special models. This was a critical market shift. The engine was no longer just a premium novelty for doctors and executives driving Roadmasters. It was being mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands. As these early 1950s Buicks began to crash, wear out, or reach the end of their life cycle, their engines found their way into local salvage yards. For a young American mechanic with a welding torch and an empty Ford Model A frame, a junkyard Nailhead was a revelation. It was narrow enough to fit between the rails of an old Ford, and it had a bottom end built like a tank. But a strange physical phenomenon happens when you force an internal combustion engine to breathe through tiny, vertically aligned valves. The design severely restricts airflow at high engine speeds, meaning the engine will choke and stop making power if revved too high. However, at low speeds, those small, restrictive intake runners force the incoming air-fuel mixture to accelerate. The velocity of the air rushing into the cylinder is violent and immediate. In practical terms, this created an engine that generated nearly all of its pulling power the instant the driver touched the throttle. It produced 300 pound-feet of torque at just 2,400 RPM. In a heavy Buick Super, this meant the car would step away from a stoplight with a smooth, effortless surge. It was exactly what luxury car buyers in 1903 expected from American Power. Yet as the engine rolled out across the American service network, it began to attract a different kind of attention. Mechanics noticed that the block was incredibly robust, cast with high nickel iron that could withstand immense internal pressure. Out in California, on dry lake beds and newly paved drag strips, a post-war culture of hot rodders was looking for cheap, durable power. They didn't care about a luxury ride or an effortless highway cruise. They cared about what happened in the first 60 feet after a flag dropped. They needed engines that hit hard, right off the line, to pull a stripped-down roadster or a lightweight rail chassis. The factory had built a motor designed entirely around the physical limitations of a 1953 luxury car frame. They had no idea they had accidentally engineered the ultimate American dragstrip weapon. To understand how a heavy luxury car engine became a foundational piece of American hot rod culture, you have to look at the physical realities of an American garage in the mid-1950s. A post-war generation of young mechanics and veterans was returning home, buying up cheap, obsolete 1930s Ford coupes and roadsters, and stripping off the heavy fenders to make them fast. They wanted V8 power, but they were bound by the constraints of geometry. The most prestigious engine of the era was the early Chrysler Hemi, a brilliant, massive power plant that made tremendous horsepower. But the Hemi was incredibly wide. If a builder wanted to drop a Chrysler Hemi into the narrow frame rails of a 1932 Ford, they often had to hack away at the chassis, cut the firewall, and alter the steering geometry. The Chevrolet small block V8, introduced in 1955, was lightweight and revolutionary. But in its early days, it lacked the raw, heavy-duty, bottom-end strength of the larger luxury engines. Then there was the Buick Nailhead. Because Buick engineers had been forced to stand the valves straight up to fit the narrow 1953 Roadmaster frame, the engine had a uniquely upright, compact profile. The cylinder heads did not splay outward like a conventional V8. Instead, the exhaust manifolds tucked tightly against the sides of the block. For a hot rodder staring at the narrow engine bay of an old Ford Model A or a custom rail dragster, The Nailhead was a geometric miracle. It slid directly between the frame rails without requiring major surgery. But the real breakthrough was not just how the engine fit, it was how the engine breathed. In internal combustion engineering, there is a constant battle between airflow volume and airflow velocity. The tiny intake valves of the Buick engine restricted the total volume of air that could enter the cylinder, a design flaw that choked the motor at high RPMs. But at low engine speeds, that same restriction created a violent mechanical advantage. Think of a garden hose. If you place your thumb over the nozzle, restricting the opening, the water does not stop. It accelerates, shooting out with greater force. The Nailhead did exactly this with its air and fuel mixture. Because the intake ports and valves were so small, the engine's vacuum pulled the air-fuel mixture from the carburetor, a device that mixes fuel and air before it enters the engine, at an incredibly high velocity. This dense, fast-moving charge slammed into the combustion chamber instantly the moment the throttle opened. The physical result was a massive spike in low-end torque. Torque is twisting force, often felt as the immediate pulling strength of an engine. While horsepower dictates how fast a machine can ultimately go, torque dictates how violently it leaves the starting line. A high-revving engine needed time to build power, requiring the driver to wait for the revolutions to climb. The Nailhead required no waiting. It delivered hundreds of pound-feet of torque at just 2,000 RPM. In a suburban driveway, this meant a heavy Buick Century could pull away from a stop sign without waking the neighbors. But on a Friday night at an amateur drag strip, or at a traffic light on a California boulevard, it meant a lightweight hot rod powered by a Buick engine would instantly break the rear tires loose and leap ahead of its rivals before they even reached their power band. The engine hit like a sledgehammer right off idle. The aftermarket industry, the network of independent speed shops, parts catalogs, and machine shops that fueled American car culture, quickly realized what Buick had accidentally created. Soon, companies like Offenhauser and Edelbrock began casting custom aluminum intake manifolds designed specifically for the unique, flat-topped Buick cylinder heads. These new manifolds allowed mechanics to bolt 2, 3, or even 4 carburetors onto the top of the Nailhead, forcing even more fuel into the high-velocity intake runners. At the same time, companies like Krieger began producing cast aluminum bell housing adapters. A bell housing adapter is a critical piece of mechanical translation. It allowed a hot rodder to take a Buick Nailhead out of a wrecked luxury car and bolt it directly to a cheap, widely available Ford manual transmission. This created a completely new mechanical system in America. The Buick factory in Flint was casting engines for doctors, bankers, and executives. But a shadow supply chain was pulling those same engines out of salvage yards, mating them to aftermarket intakes, bolting them to Ford gearboxes, and dropping them into stripped-down racing chassis. The engine had effectively split into 2 distinct American identities: the quiet, reliable luxury motor and the thundering, multi-carbureted swap meet weapon. By 1957, Buick expanded the engine's displacement, the total volume swept by the pistons inside the cylinders, raising it from the original 322 cubic inches to a larger 364 cubic inch version. The block was strengthened, the internal geometry was tweaked, and the low-end torque became even more pronounced. Automotive publications like Hot Rod magazine routinely featured Buick-powered custom builds on their covers. The factory had not intended to build a racing engine, but by the late 1950s, the physical shape of the Nailhead and the violent reality of its high-velocity torque had made it the undisputed king of the American stoplight and the early drag strip. The engine had found its believers in the salvage yards and the speed shops. The true test of its legacy, however, would come when General Motors decided to push the engine to a scale and a power level that the original engineers in 1953 had never imagined possible. By 1959, the American automotive landscape had shifted into a period of fierce, unapologetic excess. The interstate highway system was stretching across the country, and the cars built to travel it were becoming massive, steel-heavy monuments to post-war prosperity. In Detroit, a bitter corporate horsepower war was escalating. Pontiac, Ford, and Chrysler were fiercely advertising their peak horsepower numbers, trying to convince the American public that high RPM speed was the ultimate measure of an engine. But Buick took a different path. They knew exactly what their engineers had created in Flint: They knew the physical reality of the small vertical valves, the narrow cylinder heads, and the violent rush of low-end acceleration. They did not market horsepower. They marketed the one metric where the Nailhead could not be beaten: torque. For the 1959 model year, Buick introduced a massively bored and stroked version of the engine, bringing the displacement up to 401 cubic inches. When dealerships across the country opened their showroom doors, customers looked under the hoods of the new Invicta and Electra models and saw a strange number painted prominently on the massive steel air cleaner: Wildcat 445. To a casual observer, it seemed like an impossible displacement figure. But 445 was not the engine size. It was the verified torque rating: 445 pound-feet of twisting force available almost exactly as the driver stepped on the gas pedal. Buick was actively teaching the American luxury car buyer to feel torque rather than just read about horsepower. In an America where an engine could decide whether a 2-ton luxury coupe dominated a boulevard, a stripped-down dragster broke a speed record, or a weekend mechanic found his identity in a home garage, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and trust. At the Flint, Michigan assembly plant, thousands of these 401 cubic inch iron blocks were being cast, machined, and dropped into some of the heaviest passenger cars on the road. The 401 became the standard bearer for Buick's premium image. A doctor or a bank manager driving a 1960 Buick Electra 225 did not need to know how the pentroof combustion chamber worked. They only needed to know that when they pulled out to pass a truck on a 2-lane highway, the heavy car surged forward with a smooth, effortless wave of mechanical force. Mechanics in local repair shops respected the engine because the bottom end, anchored by a highly durable crankshaft and forged steel connecting rods, was virtually indestructible under normal use. The service network quickly learned that while the tiny valves limited top-end breathing, the engine required very little warranty work. It simply ran. But while the factory marketed the Wildcat 445 as the ultimate expression of quiet, refined luxury, the shadow supply chain in America's garages was pushing the engine to its absolute limits. The traditional hot rodders who had discovered the 322 cubic inch Nailhead in the 1950s had not abandoned the platform. As the engine grew to 401 cubic inches, its reputation in the underground racing culture exploded. The National Hot Rod Association, or NHRA, was formalizing drag racing across the country, turning abandoned airstrips and local tracks into organized battlegrounds. In these pit areas, smelling of high-octane fuel and burning rubber, the Nailhead was no longer just a clever engine swap for an old Ford. It was becoming a dedicated racing platform. Because the engine's torque hit instantly at low RPM, a dragster powered by a Nailhead could launch off the starting line with terrifying violence, gaining a lead in the first 60 feet that higher revving engines struggled to close. Independent machine shops and speed equipment manufacturers in California were working overtime to feed the demand. If you walked up to a parts counter in a 1961 speed shop, you could order specialized camshafts, heavy-duty valve train components, and cast aluminum intake manifolds designed specifically to bolt onto the Buick's narrow, upright cylinder heads. The engine had achieved an unprecedented duality in American culture. On Monday morning, it was the quiet, invisible force moving a family station wagon. On Friday night, it was the loud, exposed, multi-carbureted heart of a quarter-mile dragster. The block was proving it could survive both worlds. But the ultimate cultural peak of the Nailhead, the moment that permanently cemented its shape in the American industrial memory, was about to arrive with 4 engines bolted to a single frame. If the underground reputation of the Nailhead was built on local dirt tracks and late-night street races, its elevation to a national myth happened in 1961, thanks to a California drag racer and television actor named Tommy Evo. Evo wanted to build a dragster that would dominate not just the timing lights, but the crowds. To do it, he constructed a custom rail chassis known as the Showboat. He did not use one Buick engine, he used 4. Evo bolted 4 massive 401 cubic inch Nailhead V8s onto a single tubular frame. This mechanical insanity was only possible because of the engine's unique physical geometry. Because the cylinder heads did not splay outward, the nailhead was incredibly narrow. Four of them could be packaged together in a tight space where the wider Chrysler Hemis, or Ford engines, simply could not fit. Two of the Buick engines drove the front wheels, and two engines drove the rear wheels. When the showboat staged at the starting line of a 1961 dragstrip, burning high-octane fuel and breathing through 32 individual open exhaust pipes, it was no longer just a racing machine. It was a rolling earthquake of American torque. When the flag dropped, the four nailheads would instantly spin all four tires, filling the track with thick white smoke for the entire length of the quarter mile. The engine had proven that the cast iron block engineered in Flint, Michigan, could withstand the most extreme physical abuse a builder could invent. The vertical valve covers became a recognizable symbol of raw, uncompromising power. Suddenly, the aftermarket industry could not make parts fast enough. If you opened a performance catalog in 1962 from companies like Edelbrock or Moon Equipment, you could order specialized finned aluminum valve covers explicitly designed to highlight the nailhead's upright shape. The engine was no longer just a cheap swap, it had become an aesthetic statement. Traditional hot rodders began building custom cars with the engine completely exposed, polishing the aluminum intakes and painting the block, proudly displaying the narrow V8 as the centerpiece of their work. But while the engine was dominating the swap meets and drag strips, General Motors was preparing to put it into the most beautiful corporate machine of the decade. In 1963, Buick launched the Riviera. It was a massive, sleek, European-inspired personal luxury coupe that weighed over 4,000 pounds. General Motors needed a power plant that matched the Riviera's aggressive yet refined identity. They did not design a new engine. They reached for the nailhead. By 1964, Buick engineers bored and stroked the block one final time, pushing the displacement to its absolute physical limit, 425 cubic inches. For the luxury car buyer who wanted ultimate supremacy on the newly completed interstate highways, Buick offered the Super Wildcat package. This was a factory-built 425 cubic inch nailhead topped with dual quads, a setup using two 4-barrel carburetors, which are devices that mix fuel and air, mounted in tandem to force massive amounts of fuel into the engine. The Super Wildcat was rated at 340 horsepower, but more importantly, it produced a staggering 465 pound-feet of torque. In an American service bay, mechanics looked at the 425 nailhead with deep respect. It was a densely packed, heavy-duty iron block that rarely broke under pressure. A mechanic could tune the dual carburetors, adjust the timing, and know that the engine would pull a 2-ton Riviera away from a toll booth with the violence of a muscle car and the smoothness of a corporate limousine. By the mid-1960s, the Buick Nailhead had conquered every corner of American engine culture. It was idling quietly in the driveways of country clubs, and it was screaming down the asphalt at the National Hot Rod Association finals. The parts were abundant, the dealer network was strong, and the garage culture had fully embraced its bizarre, narrow shape. The block was forged, the torque was unmatched, and the engine had taught America to trust its violent low-end power. But the rulebook of American performance was about to be rewritten, and the very design that made the Nailhead a legend would soon become the exact reason it had to die. The first crack in the Buick Nailhead's empire did not sound like a breaking, connecting rod or a shattered crankshaft. It was almost invisible. It happened on the far end of the tachometer, on Friday night drag strips and newly opened stretches of American Interstate Highway around 1965. A traditional hot rodder who had trusted the heavy iron block to launch his stripped-down coupe off the starting line, would shift gears and try to push the engine past 5,500 revolutions per minute. At the starting line, the engine was a sledgehammer, but at the top end of the track, as the wind speed built and the finish line approached, the engine suddenly stopped pulling. It choked. The motor did not brake, but it could no longer breathe. The very design that had made the Nailhead a legend had officially become a trap. This was Force 1, iron, aluminum, fuel and manufacturing costs, manifesting as a rigid physical boundary that no mechanic could tune their way out of. The American horsepower war had fundamentally changed. In the 1950s, luxury car buyers and garage mechanics wanted low-end torque to move heavy steel away from a stoplight or launch a hot rod out of a red light. But by the mid-1960s, the American muscle car era had arrived. The Pontiac GTO had rewritten the rules of engagement. Buyers now wanted high RPM horsepower. They wanted engines that could breathe deeply and spin freely at 6,000 RPM. To make an internal combustion engine produce horsepower at high engine speeds, it requires massive airflow. It requires large intake runners and wide cylinder heads with large valves. But the Buick engineers in Flint, Michigan, were locked into the architecture they had drafted back in 1953. Because of the engine's incredibly narrow bore spacing, the tight distance between the centers of each cylinder, there was simply no physical room in the combustion chamber to install larger valves. Even on the massive 425 cubic inch Super Wildcat engine built for the Riviera, the absolute largest intake valve the factory could squeeze into the head was 1.875 inches. To put that in perspective, Chevrolet's new high-revving big block V8s were breathing through massive intake valves that measured well over 2 inches across. The Buick engineers were trying to feed 425 cubic inches of displacement through a straw. In the machine shops and speed equipment garages of California, mechanics tried everything to bypass this physical limit. They ported and polished the cylinder heads, spending hours at workbenches attempting to grind away cast iron to widen the air passages. They bolted on superchargers, mechanically driven devices that force air into the engine under pressure, to overcome the restrictive vertical valves. But a cast iron block can only be modified so far before the original engineering geometry refuses to yield. The engine still worked perfectly for what it was originally designed to do, quietly moving a heavy Buick Electra away from a curb. But in the highly publicized, high-stakes American performance market, the Nailhead was suddenly fighting a losing battle against newer, wider, deeper-breathing engines from Ford, Chrysler, and even Buick's own corporate siblings at Chevrolet and Pontiac. Then came Forces 6, corporate consolidation, acquisition, and brand survival. General Motors was not a sentimental company. It was an industrial empire, and its executives were obsessed with standardization and manufacturing efficiency. The entire reason the Nailhead existed, the reason it had tiny vertical valves and a bizarrely narrow profile, was because the 1953 Buick chassis had exceptionally tight frame rails. But a decade had passed. The automotive landscape had transformed. General Motors was introducing wider, standardized perimeter chassis platforms across all of its divisions. The front suspension setups were completely redesigned. The engine bays in the upcoming 1967 Buicks were going to be massive. The original problem had been solved by the evolution of the American automobile. Buick no longer needed a narrow V8. For the executives in Flint, the math was brutal and absolute. Retooling the old Nailhead architecture to try and squeeze out a few more horsepower made no financial sense. The engine had reached the end of its engineering rope. They needed a conventional V8, an engine with splayed valves, a wider footprint, and massive breathing capacity to compete in the new muscle car era. They needed an engine that could breathe at the top end of the tachometer, one that could be marketed with the massive horsepower numbers the public was demanding. In 1966, the factory quietly prepared to shut down the casting lines that had produced the Nailhead for 14 years. The engineers drafted a completely new conventional V8 family known as the Buick 400 and 430, which would debut in 1967. This new engine had large domed combustion chambers and massive valves. It was a vastly superior breathing machine. It made more horsepower. It met all the corporate requirements for the modern era. The factory had made the logical, necessary choice. The original engine had run its course, but out in the American salvage yards, the machine shops, and the hot rod garages, the mechanics were not reading corporate memos. They did not care about the 1967 assembly line, and they were not ready to let the vertical valves go. In the fall of 1966, the transition at the Flint, Michigan assembly plant was absolute. The casting molds and machining tools that had produced the Buick Nailhead for 14 years were retired. The foundry workers stopped pouring the high nickel iron for the narrow vertical valve cylinder heads. For the 1967 model year, Buick rolled out a completely new family of V8 engines featuring conventional, wide-cylinder heads that could breathe deeply at high RPMs. The new engines were powerful, efficient, and perfectly suited for the late 1960s muscle car wars. For General Motors, the problem was solved. The corporation had successfully modernized its premium division. But out in the American aftermarket, the independent speed shops, garages, and drag strips where the Nailhead had built its second identity, the discontinuation of the engine triggered a slow, inevitable collapse of its supporting system. This was forced to dealers, fleets, farmers, pilots, and service networks, playing out in the high-performance world. A hot rod engine does not survive just because the block is strong. It survives because there is an ecosystem of parts counters, catalogs, and machine shops willing to support it. In the early 1960s, a mechanic could walk into a speed shop in Southern California and find entire walls dedicated to Buick V8 performance. There were custom camshafts, specialized valve train components, and gleaming aluminum intake manifolds designed to hold 3 or 4 carburetors. But by 1968, the catalogs were changing. Companies like Edelbrock and Offenhauser had to follow the money, and the money was flowing toward the engines that were dominating the new era of drag racing. The Chevrolet small block, the Chevrolet big block, and the massive, deep-breathing Chrysler Hemi. The aftermarket industry operates on volume. Because the factory was no longer building the Nailhead, the supply of fresh engines dried up. Manufacturers slowly stopped designing new performance parts for the Buick platform. If a garage builder wanted a dual-quad intake manifold for a 401 Nailhead in 1970, they often had to hunt for a used one at a swap meet rather than ordering it new from a catalog. Simultaneously, the engine was being pushed out of competitive racing. The National Hot Rod Association, or NHRA, was watching speeds increase at terrifying rates. Top fuel dragsters were no longer amateur machines built in home garages. They were professional, highly engineered vehicles that required engines capable of spinning safely at 7,000 or 8,000 RPM while being fed volatile racing fuels. At those engine speeds, the Buick's physical architecture completely failed. The tiny vertical valves simply could not flow enough volume to compete with a Chrysler Hemi. The Hemi, an engine with massive hemispherical combustion chambers that allowed for enormous valves and unrestricted airflow, became the mandatory standard for professional drag racing. The Nailhead, which had once powered Tommy Evo's 4-engine showboat and terrorized the early drag strips, was quietly relegated to the lower amateur brackets. It could no longer win on Sunday, which meant it was no longer the engine of choice for Monday's garage builders. By the 1970s, the American salvage yard landscape had also shifted. A decade earlier, a hot rodder looking for cheap torque would immediately pull a Nailhead out of a wrecked Buick Roadmaster. But now the junkyards were filling up with crashed Chevrolet Camaros and Chevelle, packed with small block V8s. The Chevrolet small block was lighter. It had infinite parts availability. It was cheaper to build, easier to modify, and it could breathe at high speeds. For a young mechanic building a 1932 Ford replica or a custom street rod, the math was obvious. Why wrestle with an 650-pound cast-iron Buick engine that required rare, expensive, out-of-production speed parts when a Chevrolet engine bolted in easily and had the support of every parts counter in the country? The shadow supply chain that had kept the Nailhead alive finally collapsed. The engine was no longer a cheap, accessible weapon. It became an aging, heavy piece of iron that required specialized knowledge to keep running. In the driveways of suburban America, the luxury cars that originally housed these engines, the massive Electras, Invictas, and Rivieras of the late 1950s and early 1960s, were becoming cheap used cars. They were bought by high school students, driven into the ground, and eventually crushed for scrap metal. The smooth, quiet wave of low-end torque that had once defined American luxury was replaced by the chaotic, high-revving screech of the muscle car era, and later by the choked, emissions-restricted engines of the 1973 oil crisis. The original engineering problem, fitting a V8 between the narrow frame rails of a 1953 chassis, was a distant memory. General Motors was rapidly moving toward corporate consolidation, where engine architectures would eventually be shared across all brands to save money. The idea of Buick having a completely unique, bizarrely shaped, violently torquey V8 that shared almost no design philosophy with Chevrolet or Pontiac, was incompatible with modern automotive manufacturing. The corporate efficiency won. The breathing limitations of the small valves could not be overcome. The hot rodders moved on to lighter, cheaper platforms. The engine still ran. The speed catalogs moved on. The drag strips demanded more. The rulebook changed. The parts got harder to find. The factory line went dark. The vertical valves disappeared. The era of heavy torque was over. But just because the corporation and the racing industry had moved on, it did not mean the iron was dead. When General Motors shut down the casting lines for the Buick Nailhead in 1966, the corporation assumed the engine would simply fade into automotive history. For a time, it seemed they were right. The 1970s brought the oil crisis, strict emissions regulations, and the eventual downsizing of the American luxury car. Buick moved away from massive V8 power, eventually finding a new identity in the 1980s with turbocharged V6 engines. The heavy, narrow vertical valve V8 was completely erased from the corporate catalog. But American engine culture has a long memory, and old iron rarely vanishes cleanly. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a counter-movement began to sweep through the American custom car world. It was known as traditional hot rodding. A new generation of builders, along with older mechanics who remembered the 1950s, began to reject the modern trend of dropping brand new computerized Chevrolet crate engines into vintage cars. A modern engine was reliable, but it was visually sterile. It had no soul. These builders wanted engines that looked like they belonged in a post-war garage. They wanted mechanical presence. Suddenly, the odd, obsolete geometry of the Buick Nailhead was no longer a liability. It became a premium artifact. Today, if you walk through a massive American automotive swap meet, like the annual gatherings in Hershey, Pennsylvania, or Pomona, California, you will see the legacy of this engine playing out in real time. A standard Chevrolet small block might sit on a tarp, completely ignored. But if a seller unloads a rusted, grease-stained 401 cubic inch Buick Nailhead, a crowd will immediately form. Traditional hot rodders actively hunt for these blocks. They scour barns and salvage yards, looking for the distinctive vertical valve covers. They do not care that the engine cannot breathe at 6,000 RPM. They do not care that the replacement parts are rare, or that casting a custom intake manifold costs a small fortune. They rebuild them because the engine is a masterpiece of industrial sculpture. The narrow block, the upright valves, the tight exhaust manifolds. It looks like nothing else ever produced by Detroit. When a builder drops a multi-carbureted Nailhead into the exposed engine bay of a 1932 Ford Roadster, they are making a deliberate statement about aesthetics, torque, and history. But the most surprising footnote in the history of the Buick Nailhead did not happen at a drag strip, and it did not happen at a swap meet. It happened on highly classified United States Air Force bases during the Cold War. When the military developed the SR-71 Blackbird, a reconnaissance aircraft capable of flying at 3 times the speed of sound, they faced a mechanical problem on the runway. The aircraft's massive J-58 jet engines could not start themselves. They required an external starting cart to physically spin the turbines up to a massive speed before the jet fuel could be ignited. The Air Force needed an engine for this cart that was incredibly durable, relatively compact, and capable of delivering a violent amount of immediate torque to overcome the inertia of the stationary jet turbines. They did not choose a diesel. They did not choose a high-revving racing engine. The original AG-3030 start carts were built using 2 401 cubic inch Buick Nailhead V8s, bolted side by side, driving a single vertical shaft. When the Air Force needed to wake up the fastest aircraft in human history, they relied on the exact same low-end torque that was moving luxury cars in Flint and smoking tires on California drag strips. The engine that was designed to fit between the narrow frame rails of a 1953 Roadmaster ended up starting the engines of the jet age. This is not just nostalgia. A preserved Buick Nailhead sitting on an engine stand today is a physical argument about how American industry used to work. It proves that an engineering compromise can accidentally create a cultural icon. The engineers in 1953 were not trying to build a racing engine, and they certainly were not trying to build a military aviation tool. They were simply trying to solve a physical packaging problem on a factory floor. In doing so, they created a machine with such a specific, undeniable character, a machine defined by high-velocity airflow and brutal low-end torque, that it outlived its intended purpose. The corporation that built it viewed it as a temporary solution. The American garage culture viewed it as an irreplaceable piece of industrial art. The heavy luxury cars that originally carried these engines are mostly gone, crushed for scrap decades ago. The factory assembly lines have been retooled a dozen times over. The horsepower wars moved on to lighter, faster, more efficient designs. But the irons survived because the people holding the wrenches refused to let it go. Somewhere in an American swap meet, sitting on a wooden pallet stained with decades of old oil, a heavy cast iron block still waits to be found. Its shape is narrow. Its valves point straight up. And for the builder who knows exactly what they are looking at, the promise of massive, violent torque is just a rebuild away. See you in the next one.